The Christmas lights sparkled above the room as wine glasses clinked and laughter filled the air, but it wasn't joy. It was cruelty dressed as celebration. Daniel stood there in silence as his wife raised her glass and smiled. "I'm divorcing this man tonight," she announced. The room erupted. Cheers, claps, phones recording. Even the music kept playing. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't beg. He signed the papers with shaking hands, buttoned his coat and walked out into the falling snow. No slammed door. No last words. The room glowed with warm Christmas light, but nothing about the air felt warm. Golden ornaments hung from the ceiling, spinning slowly as laughter bounced off the walls, sharp and careless. A live band played soft holiday music near the bar, yet the melody felt distant, almost mocking, as if it existed only to decorate a moment that was about to turn cruel. Daniel Carter stood near the edge of the room, his shoulders slightly hunched, his fingers gripping the stem of a glass he had not touched. The wine inside reflected the lights, trembling with every small movement of his hand. He had worn his best suit, pressed carefully the night before, the same navy blue suit he used only on special occasions. Tonight was supposed to be one of those occasions. A company Christmas party, his wife's company. A chance, he thought, to belong. Melissa stood across the room, radiant in a red dress that caught every eye. She laughed loudly, confidently, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she moved from one group to another. Every laugh she gave seemed intentional, sharp, designed to remind everyone that she mattered. When her eyes finally met Daniel's, her smile did not soften. It tightened. She excused herself from her circle and walked toward him, her steps firm, deliberate, as though she had rehearsed this moment many times in her head. "Daniel," she said, loud enough for the nearest people to hear. "We need to talk." Conversation slowed around them. Not stopped, just quiet enough to listen. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Okay." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thin folder. White, clean, final. She placed it against his chest, pressing it there as though it belonged to him already. "I'm done pretending," Melissa said. "I'm tired of excuses. I'm tired of carrying someone who has no ambition." A few people shifted closer. Someone raised a phone. Daniel opened the folder slowly. Divorce papers. Already prepared. Already signed by her. The words blurred as his eyes scanned the page. Not because he could not read, but because his chest felt too heavy to breathe properly. "Here?" he asked quietly. "Tonight?" Melissa laughed. "Why not? It's Christmas. New beginnings." Someone behind her snickered. Daniel's fingers trembled as he turned the pages. His name sat at the bottom, waiting. The pen rested neatly inside the folder, placed there with intention. This was not a discussion. This was a performance. "You don't even contribute," Melissa continued, her voice rising just enough to ensure the room could hear. "No big job. No car worth mentioning. No future I can be proud of. Do you know how embarrassing that is for me?" Daniel swallowed. His face burned. He felt dozens of eyes on him now, measuring him, judging him, deciding who he was based on this single moment. "I loved you," he said, barely louder than a breath. Melissa rolled her eyes. Love doesn't pay bills. The band kept playing. A waiter passed by, uncomfortable, pretending not to notice. A manager leaned against the wall, curious. Phones were no longer hidden. Daniel picked up the pen. His hand paused midair. For a moment, memories pressed against him. A smaller apartment. Quiet dinners. The night he had proposed without fireworks or luxury, only sincerity. He remembered how Melissa had smiled then, how she had said she didn't care about money. He remembered believing her. A tear slipped down his cheek, uninvited, unstoppable. It landed on the paper, smudging nothing, changing nothing. "There," someone whispered. "He's crying." Melissa smiled thinly. "Just sign it, Daniel. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." His signature took longer than usual. Each letter heavy, deliberate, final. When he finished, he closed the folder gently, as though it might shatter if handled roughly. He handed it back to her. For a split second, something unreadable flickered in her eyes. Then it was gone. "Good," she said. "You can leave now." Daniel nodded once. He placed the pen back into the folder, straightened his jacket, and looked around the room. Faces turned away quickly, some out of guilt, others out of satisfaction. "Merry Christmas," he said softly. Laughter followed him as he walked toward the exit. Someone joked about returning gifts. Someone else commented on his cheap suit. The doors closed behind him with a dull final sound. Outside, the cold night air hit his face, sharp and unforgiving. Snow began to fall, light at first, settling on his shoulders as he stood alone on the steps, breathing deeply, silently, as the sound of celebration continued inside without him. He wiped his face, not in anger, not in regret, but in acceptance. None of them knew who he really was. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Daniel did not rush away from the building. He stood beneath the stone archway of the hotel entrance as snow continued to fall, thin flakes drifting slowly, quietly, as though the night itself was listening. Cars pulled up and drove off behind him. Engines humming, doors opening, laughter spilling out into the cold before disappearing again. No one noticed him standing there, and for the first time that night, he welcomed the invisibility. He loosened his tie and slipped it into his coat pocket. His hands had stopped shaking, but his chest still felt tight, like a door closed too suddenly. He inhaled deeply, letting the cold air steady him, and then exhaled slowly, watching his breath fade into the dark. A black sedan waited across the street, its headlights off. It had been there all evening. Daniel crossed the road without hesitation and opened the rear door. The driver stepped out immediately, tall and broad-shouldered, his movements precise, respectful. "Good evening, sir," the driver said. "I'm sorry I was late." Daniel shook his head as he slid into the back seat. "You were exactly on time." The door closed quietly, sealing him into warmth and silence. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar, familiar and grounding. The car pulled away smoothly, blending into the flow of traffic as the hotel lights faded behind them. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The city passed by in soft blurs of light and shadow. Daniel rested his head against the window, watching reflections slide across the glass, his expression calm now, almost distant. Finally, the driver spoke. "Your father has been calling." Daniel closed his eyes. "I expected that." "He's concerned," the driver continued carefully. "The board meeting is approaching. He hoped you would attend this year." Daniel gave a small, humorless smile. "He always hopes." The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city falling away. Daniel straightened slightly, his posture changing, as if he were shedding a skin he no longer needed. The softness drained from his face, replaced by something firmer, more controlled. "I'll attend," he said, "but not as a guest." The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, surprised but relieved. "Yes, sir." They arrived at a private residence just beyond the city, set back behind iron gates and tall trees dusted with snow. The gates opened before the car even stopped. Recognizing the vehicle, recognizing him, inside the house stood silent and imposing, its windows glowing faintly against the dark sky. Daniel stepped inside and removed his coat. The house smelled of old wood and polished stone, of history and power. He walked through the hall without hesitation, his footsteps echoing softly, until he reached a study at the far end. The door was open. His father stood near the fireplace, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. Richard Carter was a tall man, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed impeccably even at home. He did not turn when Daniel entered, but his reflection watched him in the glass above the mantel. "So," Richard said calmly, "you signed the papers." Daniel stopped a few feet behind him. "Yes." Richard nodded slowly. "I warned you." "You warned me about money," Daniel replied. "Not about people." Richard turned then, studying his son closely. "People reveal themselves when they think there is nothing to gain." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. They did. Silence stretched between them, thick but not hostile. This was not a confrontation. It was an understanding long delayed. "You could have stopped it," Richard said. "One phone call. One transfer." Daniel shook his head. "Then I would never know who she was." Richard took a slow sip of his drink. "And now?" Daniel stepped closer to the fire, its warmth brushing his face. "Now I know." Richard watched him carefully. "Are you angry?" Daniel considered the question honestly. "No," he said after a moment. "I'm clear." That answer seemed to satisfy his father. He set the glass down and reached into a drawer, pulling out a thin folder, darker and heavier than the one Daniel had signed earlier that night. "Your shares," Richard said, handing it to him. "They were always yours. You only had to claim them." Daniel accepted the folder without opening it. "I'm not here to hide anymore." Richard's lips curved slightly. Good. Because the company could use a man who understands restraint. Daniel looked into the fire, watching the flames shift and settle. They humiliated me tonight, he said quietly. Not because I deserved it, but because they thought I was powerless. Richard's voice remained steady. Power does not announce itself. Daniel nodded. No, it arrives. He turned from the fire, his expression composed, deliberate. I don't want chaos. I don't want revenge that looks like anger. Richard raised an eyebrow. What do you want? Daniel answered without hesitation. Control. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city inch by inch, silent and patient, as Daniel Carter finally stepped back into the world he had once abandoned. This time, not as a son trying to escape his name, but as a man ready to use it. Morning arrived slowly, gray and deliberate, as though the city itself was waking with caution. Daniel stood by the tall windows of the study, watching the sky lighten over rooftops and towers that belonged to him in ways no one suspected. He had not slept, not because of pain, but because his mind had settled into a rare and focused calm. Every thought felt aligned now, moving in one clear direction. A quiet knock sounded at the door. Come in, Daniel said without turning. The door opened and a woman stepped inside, tablet in hand, posture sharp and confident. Evelyn Moore had worked with the Carter family for over 15 years. She had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, dismantled hostile boards, and silenced lawsuits before they ever reached the press. Her loyalty was not emotional. It was professional and absolute. You asked for a full briefing, she said. On Melissa Grant and her company. Daniel turned from the window and gestured toward the table. Start from the beginning. Evelyn tapped her tablet, her fingers moving swiftly. Grant & Lowe Consulting. Mid-sized firm. Strong public image, weak internal structure. Their growth over the last 18 months is artificial, propped up by one primary investor. Daniel took a seat, folding his hands calmly. Who? Evelyn looked up. Us. The word hung in the air, heavy with quiet irony. Indirectly, she continued. 3 shell partnerships, 2 venture arms. All traced back to Carter Global. Daniel nodded once. She never asked where the money came from. No, Evelyn said. She only cared that it arrived. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than amused. And the Christmas party? Evelyn hesitated. Phones were recording. The footage hasn't surfaced yet, but it will. People love humiliation when it feels justified. Daniel's jaw tightened for a brief moment, then relaxed. Make sure it doesn't disappear. Evelyn blinked. You want it released? In time, Daniel replied. Truth has more weight when people recognize themselves in it. Evelyn studied him carefully. What is your objective? Daniel answered evenly. I want them to feel stable while the ground shifts. No warnings, no drama. Evelyn nodded. Then the first move should be quiet. She tapped the screen again. Tomorrow morning, our investment arm withdraws from Grant & Lowe. No announcement. No explanation. Just absence. Daniel's eyes followed the slow movement of clouds outside. What will that do? They will scramble, Evelyn said. Payroll will tighten. Credit lines will wobble. Partners will start asking questions. Daniel nodded. Good. And Melissa? Evelyn asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. He stood and walked back toward the window, hands behind his back. She wanted me small, he said finally, so let her see what small actually feels like. Evelyn closed the tablet. Understood. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked through the headquarters of Carter Global Group for the first time in years. The building rose clean and imposing from the street, glass and steel reflecting the sky like a controlled mirror. Inside, everything moved with precision. People spoke softly but decisively, eyes forward, steps measured. Some recognized him instantly. Others only felt the shift in atmosphere as he passed. A conference room had been prepared at the top floor. Long table, dark wood, city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the windows. Daniel took the seat at the head without ceremony. Executives filtered in, conversations lowering, curiosity sharpening. They had heard rumors. They always did. Daniel waited until the room settled. I won't take much of your time, he began, his voice calm, steady, impossible to ignore. But I want to be clear about one thing. I am not here to observe. A few glances were exchanged. I am here to decide. No one spoke. Daniel continued. Effective immediately. I am assuming active control of strategic acquisitions and divestments. All recommendations will pass through my office. A senior executive cleared his throat. May we ask why now? Daniel looked at him evenly. Because now is honest. That was all. By evening, the withdrawal had begun. Numbers shifted quietly across screens. Contracts expired without renewal. Support vanished without explanation. No one made phone calls. No one issued statements. At Grant and Lowe Consulting, the lights stayed on late. Melissa sat in her office, heels kicked off. Phone pressed to her ear, her voice tight with irritation. They just disappeared, she said. No warning. No email, nothing. Her partner paced the room. That funding was half our operating capital. Melissa stared at the city through her own glass window, irritation turning slowly into unease. Find out who's behind it. I'm trying, he replied. But everything leads to dead ends. She ended the call and sat back, exhaling sharply. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Another concern. Another crack in the polished image she worked so hard to maintain. Somewhere across the city, Daniel stood in silence as the first piece fell exactly where he intended. He did not smile. This was not satisfaction. This was alignment. The boardroom at Grant and Lowe Consulting had never felt so small. The long glass table that once reflected confidence and ambition now reflected tension, unease, and faces that refused to meet each other's eyes. Outside, the city moved as it always did, indifferent to the quiet panic building behind the closed doors. Melissa sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her hands folded carefully in front of her. She had chosen a neutral outfit that morning, something controlled and professional, but no amount of polish could soften the sharp edge in her expression. She had spent the entire night fielding calls, reading emails, refreshing financial dashboards that refused to improve. They pulled out everything, the finance director said, breaking the silence. Not just future funding, existing commitments too. Melissa's jaw tightened. That's not how serious investors operate. No, he replied carefully. But it's how power operates when it doesn't need permission. A murmur moved around the table. Another executive leaned forward. Our credit line is under review. Vendors are asking for revised terms. If this continues, we will miss payroll within the month. Melissa raised her hand slightly and the room fell quiet again. We will not panic, she said. Someone is testing us. Her phone vibrated against the table. She ignored it. Across town, in a room designed for certainty, Daniel watched a different screen. Market responses. Internal reports. Carefully filtered. Reactions from companies that did not yet know they were standing at the edge of a much larger shift. Evelyn stood beside him, tablet in hand. They're feeling it. Daniel nodded. They should. The footage from the Christmas party is circulating privately, Evelyn continued. Shared in small groups. Reactions are mixed. Good, Daniel said calmly. Let it breathe. By the end of the week, Melissa's confidence had begun to crack. Her calendar filled with emergency meetings. Her nights shortened, her temper sharpened. The world that once applauded her decisiveness now questioned it. At a networking event, conversations stopped when she approached. Smiles felt forced. Compliments lacked warmth. Someone asked too casually, if everything was all right at the firm, it's just restructuring. Melissa replied, though the words felt thin even to her. She did not see Daniel standing across the room, speaking quietly with two executives who listened with attentive respect. He had entered without announcement. Dressed simply but immaculately, his presence subtle yet undeniable. When his eyes briefly met hers, he gave no sign of recognition. Melissa frowned. Something about him felt familiar, unsettling. She looked away. 2 days later, an invitation arrived. Emergency shareholders meeting. Mandatory attendance. Hosted by Carter Global Group. Melissa stared at the email, her heart pounding slightly harder than it should have. Carter Global was a name everyone knew, untouchable, distant, a force that did not concern itself with companies her size. Until now. The auditorium was filled with quiet tension. Shareholders whispered. Executives sat rigidly in their seats. Melissa took her place near the front, her mind racing through possibilities, rehearsing explanations, preparing defenses. The lights dimmed. A figure stepped onto the stage. Daniel. For a moment, the room did not react. Then recognition spread slowly, unevenly, like a wave that took time to form. Melissa's breath caught. Her hands tightened around the armrests. Daniel stood at the podium, calm, composed, his voice steady when he spoke. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." He paused, allowing the silence to settle. "Carter Global Group has recently acquired a majority stake in several partner firms," he continued, "including this one." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Melissa's pulse roared in her ears. Daniel's gaze swept across the audience and stopped deliberately on her. "Change often feels sudden," he said evenly, "but it is usually the result of long neglect." He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply spoke, and the room listened. "Effective immediately," Daniel continued. "Leadership structures will be reviewed. Performance will be evaluated without bias or sentiment." Melissa felt as though the floor beneath her had shifted. This was not chaos. This was order imposed from above. Daniel stepped back from the podium, his expression unreadable. For the first time since the Christmas party, Melissa understood something she had never considered before. The man she had dismissed, the man she had humiliated, the man who had signed those papers in tears. He was not reacting. He was executing. The meeting ended without applause. People rose slowly from their seats, conversations muted. Eyes filled with questions they were suddenly afraid to ask. The room no longer belonged to Grant and Lowe. It belonged to something larger, something colder, something precise. Melissa remained seated as others filed past her. Her body still, her mind racing too fast to settle. Daniel watched from the side of the stage as the room emptied. He did not hurry. There was nothing left to prove here. Everything that needed to be understood had already landed. Evelyn approached quietly. "Your father is waiting upstairs." Daniel nodded. In a moment. Melissa stood then, her movement stiff, deliberate. She turned and walked toward him, heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the space itself resisted her. "Daniel," she said, stopping a few feet away. He looked at her calmly, as though she were a colleague he barely remembered. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "If I had known—" He raised a hand gently, not in anger, but in finality. "That's the point." Her expression tightened. "You let me believe you were nothing. I let you believe what you chose to believe," Daniel replied evenly. "I never lied." She searched his face for something familiar. The softness, the patience. The man who apologized even when he was not wrong. She found none of it. "You embarrassed me," she said, her voice lowering. "You could have handled this privately." Daniel met her gaze steadily. "You didn't." The word settled between them, undeniable. Melissa swallowed. "Is this revenge?" Daniel considered her carefully. "No," he said. "This is consequence." Silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy. "You cried," she said finally, almost accusingly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Because I was grieving something real." She laughed weakly. "You expect me to believe this was all some test?" "No," he said. "It was a choice, yours." He stepped past her, ending the conversation without ceremony. Upstairs, the city spread out beneath wide glass windows, lights blinking like distant stars. Richard Carter stood waiting, hands clasped behind his back. "You were restrained," Richard said. "More than I expected?" Daniel joined him at the window. "Anger would have been easier." "And louder," his father replied. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I wanted clarity. For her, for them, for me." Richard studied his son with quiet approval. "You learned what power truly is." Daniel nodded. "It doesn't raise its voice." Days later, the world adjusted. Leadership shifted. Contracts were rewritten. Some executives stayed. Others were let go without drama or spectacle. Grant and Lowe survived, but it was no longer hers. Melissa packed her office in silence, placing awards into boxes that felt lighter than they should have. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going next. As she passed through the lobby, she saw the Christmas decorations still stored in the corner, waiting to be put away. The sight tightened her chest unexpectedly. Outside, snow began to fall again. Across the city, Daniel stood alone in his office, watching the same snow settle softly against the glass. His phone buzzed once. A message from his father. A brief acknowledgement. Nothing more was needed. Daniel turned back to his desk and resumed his work. He had not destroyed anyone. He had simply stopped pretending. And in that quiet truth, the world had rearranged itself accordingly.